Mr. Ogbole,
yes.
You come in with a very unique perspective because you are a farmer. You've seen kind of the various positions and the issues that have arisen over time. What is your overall assessment of what is taking place in the country as it relates to the Fulani herdsmen and farmers around the country and the clashes that are taking place?
Thank you very much, Ajuri. I want to begin by registering my condolences to our brothers in Plateau State and people elsewhere in Nigeria who have become a people of common pain with Benue State. From the gruesome New Year gift of the murder of 73 innocent farmers in Benue State to the killing of 22 people in Omusu in Opoku, up to the killing of 2 priests and 17 worshippers in Balom, the activities of Fulani herdsmen militia has actually continued to leave a trail of mountain of bodies and rivers of blood within the farming communities in North Central and Benue in particular. Benue has actually become a community under threat with over 180 people displaced in IDP camps and over 500,000 of others living with relatives in the neighboring and surrounding cities. And what are the implications of this? Number one, besides us mourning the loss of our precious loved ones, the decimation of the workforce that should have become an instrument of development to Benue State, a lot of people in the IDP camps, there is food shortage in the IDP camp, there is health crisis in the IDP camps, children are out of school in the IDP camps, and then the hope of us being able to exercise our civic duties in 2019 election is actually bleak right now because of the unsettled nature, of things in Benue State. So Benue is still a community under threat. We are still bleeding because the killings have continued unabated, since the renewed attacks from January 1st, even up till now. That is the current situation. And with reference to the subject matter my Chief Press Secretary has been dealing with, we are in a war, and this war has many flanks and many fronts. Each state that they attack is a battlefront, and each flank also of narrative is a major flank. For instance, there is a political flank of this particular war, and then there is the media flank of this particular war. And in a war, everything actually becomes a weapon, from propaganda to outright falsehood and mischief. All of these things are used, in a warfare. The current narrative, apart from all of the shifting narratives we've had on this particular issue, you will find the IG of police calling it a communal clash. The DSS said it was Islamic State of West Africa. Mansour Dan Ali, the defense minister, said it was because cattle routes were blocked. Mieti Allah Katahore said it is because a law was enacted, that has hampered the effective movement of cattle around there. And then now, the new narrative is what we call the blame the victim approach. Blame the victim seeks to place all of the responsibilities for these killings on the people of Benue State who are actually the victims of this situation. It's just another angle of narratives that is opening up, all to confuse both Nigerians and the international community on the subject matter of what is happening in Benue State and in central Nigeria. All that we need to know, that the world needs to know now, is that Benue and North Central states are a community under threat by the activities of this militia, and this militia have actually not been brought to book. They have not been militarily conquered yet. So there is no peace or security in that region.
Mr. Ogbole, to do a comprehensive justice to this matter, one would have to acknowledge that it goes beyond the Middle Belt. You talk about what has happened in Zamfara. You're talking of hundreds being slaughtered within days.
Beautiful. I agree with you.
I have not finished, Mr.
From
Ogbole.
in the south to Zamfara up in the north.
I have not finished, Mr. Ogbole. And these are predominantly Muslim communities that have been ravaged, both farmers and herdsmen, by cattle rustlers, by bandits. So you've talked about it in this kind of a frame that it's just propaganda, that you're hearing multiple stories from multiple sides. But all available intelligence, even from foreign armed services, indicate that all of these things, from Islamic State of West Africa to herdsmen, to climactic factors, to banditry, that these are all real factors, real contributing factors to the violence we see in the country today. Can you boil it down to mere propaganda in view of the facts on ground?
when I talk about propaganda as an instrument used in this warfare, I'm talking about the Benue situation of blaming the victim. It is simply another narrative. I will not understand fully whether all of these factors are contributory, but the fact that we have shifting narratives on this issue spells something that is very, very sinister. When a status quo that is negative, especially involving the loss of lives, is allowed to continue in a nation like Nigeria, it is a sign that one party or somebody or one ethnicity is profiting from the status quo. How can all of these factors interplay, and then the Nigerian government has not risen to be able to play its role of the security of lives and properties, and then we are blaming it to one factor or the other? If it is Gaddafi trained mercenaries that have infiltrated Nigeria, that is an affront on the territorial integrity of a nation like Nigeria. And I strongly believe that the government of Nigeria should rise up. It's an act of war declared on us. What has been done in that regard so far? We are here actually to query and to decry the apathy on the part of the government of Nigeria to be able to handle this issue decisively. This cannot be handled until the narrative is set aright.
This is a very interesting issue that you have just raised, which is the perceived apathy of the federal government on this issue. Because right now we've seen a kind of a sea change on the part of the Benue State Governor, Samuel Otom, concerning the response of the federal government. Of course, months back, he was very upset with the federal government, with the Buhari administration, saying, look, they're not doing enough, our people need to defend themselves, etc., etc. But now, in recent times, in recent weeks, we've heard the governor come out publicly to say, look, the federal government has done very well. They have, since the reinforcements of troops have moved into Benue, we've seen a reduction in the killings in the state. And he's been essentially praising the federal government's efforts over the last 1 month. So in view of that, Mr. Akase, you're the CPS. You know very well what I'm saying.
I was going to tell you why.
Why is that?
Very interesting question, Ajuri. You see, that tells you that Governor Samuel Otom is a leader who is fair and who upholds justice and equity. If you do the right thing, he praises you. You do the wrong one, he tells you this is wrong. And he calls a spade a spade. When things were not being done rightly, as you know, regarding the Benue situation, he spoke out and said, look, not much is being done. The federal government had to do more. And now that Mr. President has, moved, decisively, we now have Operation Wild Stroke in Benue State, tackling the militia here and there, and even their members. You have soldiers who have been killed and wounded. That shows commitment. We may not have gotten there yet, but progress is being made. And that's why the governor has to still tell the world that I was the one who said, look, not much was being done. But now I have seen that something is being done. Even though my people are not yet safe, our communities are still occupied, besieged by the militia. But what we have seen now is that there is a commitment. And we think with what we are seeing, we will get there. So he urges, the other day he was at the hospital, the military hospital, and commended the military, commended the troops, and encouraged them not to relent. That Benue is behind them. Benue is behind Operation Wild Stroke. That they should do what they are doing. The government of Benue State will give them all the support to succeed. So that is why Governor Otom has seen commitment now, and he has to commend the troops on what they are doing. But let's not forget that Benue communities are still under siege. The Operation Wild Stroke is doing their best, but we are not yet there. So more needs to be done.
Mr. Ogbole, hearing from Mr. Akase now, do you still hold on to that notion that there is apathy on the part of the federal government?
Every life of Nigerians matter. And when we talk about this, it's important to note that reduction in the killings is a welcome development. But there shouldn't be killings at all, because every Nigerian life matters. So if they are trying so far, more needs to be done, and it needs to be done fast. I strongly believe that the Nigerian security apparatus has enough, armaments, enough training, and enough zeal to be able to flush these matters out within 1 week or within 1 month. This can actually be ended. This can actually be solved. But the question is, how many more lives will this situation take before this monster is brought to justice? Every Nigerian life matters. So it's not a reduction in killing we're talking about. It's a total end, a total stop to the killings in Nigeria. That's what we are going for.
Mr. Ogbole, you know, when we talk about solutions to this problem, you hear so many different perspectives. Some people will say cattle colonies is the solution. Some people say the re-establishment of grazing routes is the solution. Some people say we have to establish ranches across the Federation, all of which have been roundly rejected by the state governments within the Middle Belt that are being affected by the crisis that we see. In view of that, is there a solution to this problem that is missing, that is not being discussed on the part of the federal government? Because it seems that everything that they have brought out has been rejected by the relevant state governments. Is there something that actually can be done and agreed on by all parties, in your view?
Before we go into those elements of solution, it's important to note that when Hitler and his allies threatened global peace, Hitler had to be militarily defeated first before there was a denazification program. So the first thing that has to and needs to be done in this situation is to militarily defeat all of these elements that have threatened the balance of Nigeria's peace and security. That's the first point of solution. Number two, the narratives on this particular subject matter has to be very, very clear. If the narrative is not clear, especially from the political office holders or the political flank, it will actually set a confusion as to what the security apparatus or organization should do. So the narratives have to be set very, very clear. And then I want to ask this question. From the time when the open grazing prohibition and ranches establishment law of Benue State was enacted in 2017 till now, how many cattle or pastoralists or cattle breeders organizations have approached the Benue State government for land for ranches? How many of them? The question is none. All because they are not prepared to take a sustainable, culturally relevant approach to solution. They are bent on imposing their Stone Age culture of open grazing on the rest of the Nigerians, and that offends our sensibility.
Mr. Ogbole, so, I have to push back on this point because I'm aware of the contents of the law, and it's very clear that even if a herdsman or a pastoralist wants to procure land, that he has to do so in phases of 1 year, 1 year leases essentially. So the idea that he's being offered an opportunity to purchase land in perpetuity to be able to conduct his business is not really, it's a bit misleading because clearly they're being relegated to 1 year leases. Is it not fair to say that in some ways that the herdsmen, in this case the pastoralists, are being limited from having access to land that others in other industries are having access to?
Ajuri, it's important to note that not everything is as they appear. When you get to the root of all of this clamor and the shifting issues from cattle colonies to grazing reserves and so on, it is nothing but a drive towards land acquisition. If you note the history of the Fulanis, they come from Guinea, where they are not allowed, to hold political power. So having had 3 presidents, 7 presidents in Nigeria, they feel that that's a political platform for them to be able to lay claim to Nigeria as a land that belongs to them. So they are inviting, their fellow Fulanis from all over West Africa to come to Nigeria, and they are even arrogating the right of conquest over Nigeria. I'm coming, please. So all of this is nothing but a land acquisition move. If you see the content of the grazing reserve proposition, the cattle colony, they bear the same string. The land they are requesting a land that they can own, a land that they can further develop into an emirate within the enclaves of Nigeria.
Mr. Ogbole, I'm going to
allocate it to Fulanis all over from one community to the other is something that is appalling and is something that is unacceptable.
I'm going to come in here because, first of all,
it's a land grab mission.
We have to be very careful in terms of of whether or not we're discriminating against a people. Because first of all, if you are offering land in perpetuity to a foreign investor to establish a factory, and he wants to establish a set of factories beginning with one, you will not say that he's coming in to establish a foreign government or a foreign territory. In the case of the herdsmen, you're alleging an emirate. Does that not have the undertone of ethnic discrimination?
Whoever comes to equity must have or must come with clean hands. We are not discriminating against them. We are saying the system must be equitable in the sense that if they come up to us to request land that they can own to establish their ranches or to graze freely, they should be able to give land to Benue indigents up north who rear pigs.
You're going to get
they should be able to give land to Benue indigents
you're going to get a chance
up
to finish your
north who are able to do the agricultural
Mr. Ogbole, you're going to get a chance you're going to finish your thought. We're going to, unfortunately, just take a short break, and we will be back in a moment. You will finish your thought. Our viewers, please do stay with us. Welcome back to Sunrise Daily, coming to you live from our Abuja studio. We were just before the break. You were concluding your thoughts, Mr. Ogbole, on this notion that there may be some sort of discrimination against the Fulani ethnic stock in Benue State under this law. What were your thoughts? Yeah,
the provision of the Open Grazing Prohibition Law and Ranches Establishment 2017 still stands. It has not been repealed. And it doesn't matter what we say, a law is a law, and the provisions are still binding. And the provision, it provides for them to be able to come and then follow due process in getting land to be able to establish their ranches. So if we have gone to the extent of imputing that clause inside of the law, it shows how embracing we are. It is not aimed at discriminating anybody at all. It is not a stigmatization move. It is not discriminatory at all. What we actually are looking at on the other side, because this must be balanced, is that the current practice of gun-wielding, community-occupying, and life-destroying, people is what we are afraid of. There are the pastoralists, and then there are the militia hired by these pastoralists to actually attack our communities. I must say in my first interview here, I acknowledge that we've had a beautiful marriage or correlation or relationship with pastoralists over the years. But in recent times, this marriage began to produce the offspring of blood. That is what we are afraid of right now. So the people of Benue State are living in fear. Even if these people come as pastoralists who come to graze their cattle, we give them land and then they establish ranches. What are the conditions? What is the guarantee that the militia that destroys our community will not come and find refuge inside of these ranches, to attack the surrounding communities? They are allowed to come over and do their businesses to the extent that it does not interfere with the peace, the security of the lives and properties of the people within the host community.
Should the focus then not be on how do you now separate these innocent, legitimate pastoralists from the militants? Because ultimately, if the issue is about the violence, if the issue is about the bloodshed and the oppression and the occupation that we're talking about, this is done by those who are wielding arms. If those two are separated by some means, would the Benue State people, for example, not feel more free to accommodate, herdsmen in perpetuity, as they have been doing for centuries and decades now?
That can only be speculated or anticipated. Practice is what we want. It is a practice of it, the separation, that will actually safeguard lives. So we can't be here and then we're speculating on what should happen and use that as a basis of how we operate.
Mr. Akase, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me go back to the issue of leasing land for ranching that you talked about earlier. I think that pastoralists should rather be grateful to the Benue State government and Benue people for making a law that enhances their nomadic, that may even promote their nomadic way of doing business, of cattle rearing. The law says you get land on lease for 1 year, and it is renewable, which means if you don't like this land, next year you move to another place. That is a bit nomadic, and I think is pastoralist friendly. That's what the law says. That if you have this land for 1 year, Next year, you may go to another place. And government also has the right to revoke the lease if perhaps your ranch is seen to have constituted a security threat. But that's a different thing. Now, I think that pastoralists should be happy that there is a law in place that gives them the opportunity to, to rear their livestock here and next year move to another place.
Mr. Akase.
So back to, you see, seriously, we have had statements from this group, from the pastoralists that tend to threaten the security of this country, not only Benue State. Just 2 days ago, we read in the papers that Mieti Alakautahore said that the land called Nigeria belongs to them. I read it in some newspaper of 1st July. Now, when a group of people rises to say that, look, this land belongs to us, that they said if they had wanted to take over Nigeria, they would have taken over. And they were particular about Benue State.
Mr. Akase, we have to, it's very important that when we make statements that we also produce the context. No,
but I said July 1st, Sun newspaper, July 1st.
Where I'm coming from, the context of that statement was access to land as a Nigerian citizen, not actual ownership of the land.
Well, that's your interpretation. That's your interpretation. I read and I interpreted it the way I saw it. They said if they had wanted, that the land Nigeria belongs to Fulanis. Now, when you make a statement like this and security agencies read the same newspapers and no one asks questions, then it scares people.
Okay, Mr. Akase, let me ask you, when you look at the situation in the country today, and let's go back 4 or 5 years. We know that under the administration of former President Dr. Goodluck Jonathan, the National Economic Council approved 100 billion naira for the establishment of ranches. Of course, in yesterday's naira, as at that time, that was proportionate to $600 million US. Now, we obviously know that money was not used to fund the establishment of ranches. But at that time, there were no state governments that were kicking against the establishment of ranches. Now, I want to ask you, do you believe it's a coincidence that when we have a President Muhammadu Buhari, who happens to be of the Fulani ethnic stock, who's also a farmer, that he's president now, that there's this kind of rejection? Is it linked to a kind of a mistrust or a mistrust between the same organs of government that existed before when everybody was in agreement on this issue?
It doesn't have anything to do with the president. What Benue State is saying is that we have a law. Remember, there were killings in Benue long before this law was made last year. And successive governments of the state were looking for solutions. And when Governor Otom came on board, he said, look, we have found a solution. And the solution is that open grazing can no longer hold. It's no longer feasible. I mean, it's not practicable. Now, the way to go globally is ranching. And this law, what the government of Benue is saying is not to reject the proposals from the federal government. What we are saying is that we accept ranching to the extent that the proposed ranching conforms, agrees with the provisions of the law made by Benue State. It's as simple as this. Look, we have embraced ranching. We embraced ranching long before the federal government started talking about it. So we feel that the federal government has embraced what Benue has been saying. But the proposals, perhaps, coming from the federal government, do not agree with what Benue is saying, because we have no land where you can find 5,000 hectares to give for cattle colony or cluster ranching, as it has been said.
Mr. Ogbole, I've heard from some stakeholders in this larger debate that, look, if the president, for example, did not have a security council that was predominantly northern in terms of ethnic stock, that there would be greater trust in terms of how the security challenges within these regions are being confronted. Do you think that the relative unwillingness of the administration to accommodate some of these cries for diversification of the security architecture has led to the kind of distrust that would, kind of stop state governments from effectively coordinating with the federal government to solve these problems?
Yes, I strongly believe it is a contributing factor. Even though if it was in a just, society, the ethnicities of the people in the Security Council will really not matter, because they swore under oath, to uphold the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. And we are not challenging the fact that our security apparatus or council is dominated by one ethnic group. We are simply saying, even if it is one ethnicity dominating the Security Council, they should do what is right. They should uphold the Constitution. They should be fair in terms of response, to crisis wherever crisis happens, even if it is within the Fulani enclaves or within the Tiv enclaves or even in Abakaliki. Fairness and justice is actually what we are advocating for. But in this situation now, it appears as if it is the rest of Nigeria versus one ethnic group that actually has dominated the security apparatus now. And Nigerians actually have a right to express their mistrust on this particular setup, where you have the Security Council meeting and then one language seems to be the lingua franca. That's nepotistic. That is unacceptable. And if we have a responsive government, that should have been addressed to be able to, restore the trust of people back on the security apparatus of the nation. Because anywhere there is no trust on the security apparatus of the nation, you see people going outside of the law to be able to seek justice because they feel the law is guilty of injustice.
Mr. Ogbole, I believe that's a very fine place to leave it. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There are so many issues to get into. But I want to thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming on the program this morning and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ajuri.
Standing by with us have been Mr. Terver Akase, the Chief Press Secretary to the Benue State Governor, Dr. Samuel Ortom, and Mr. Dave Ogbole, who is both a farmer and a public affairs analyst. At this juncture, we'll close the segment, and I throw it over to our Lagos studio, where Chamberlain is standing by. Chamberlain?